Hello everyone, and thanks for coming back to the channel. Today we're taking a look at the RunCam Split 3 Nano. Yes, our HD/FPV cameras continue to get micro-sized, and that's good because I love micros. While I don't have an original to compare it to, what we're going to compare it to, at least on the desk here, is the baby turtle from Caddx, but I wanted to give you a quick look at the back of the board. Got a little clamp there that the cables, as you see, are all kind of strung together. We have a little bit of, I think this is some sort of tape or something to keep these together, to keep things out of harm's way, and they connect with a little, I don't know what these connectors are necessarily called, but they kind of clamp down in there, so that is presumably to help them stay in place. And right up here is the microphone, so you don't have to worry about maintaining a microphone with a wire on it, so that takes a little bit more space on the board, but that is the microphone, and we'll give that a quick listen. Of course, we've got components spread all throughout the board. We've got an even 20 by 20 on the mounting stack, so that can go on most of the stacks that we're using nowadays, especially in micros. And a look at the other side of the board as well, where our SD slot goes in. We do have an SD card slot keeper, I guess you'd call this. Goes right over here. You mount it down with it. Oh, got it backwards. You mount it down here, and that keeps your SD card from just popping out in a crash. It's got a little clip here on the end that'll keep the card in. It's pretty easy to maintain. That's something that RunCam has been doing on their version of these HD FPV cameras. I do think it's worth noting that we have some apparently contact points here on the back of the camera that could be important when it comes to your mounting and butting this up against other electronics that you probably don't want to touch anything back there. I would prefer there be a little bit of a backing on this just for that purpose of keeping all these little tiny components safe from other component contact. But it's there. I don't know what the red mark on there means. Maybe that means voltage over here. Maybe the other side's ground. Not sure. They don't have a pinout or schematic. I'm sure that's a trade secret. But we see we've also got that kind of on these corners as well. They're almost like solder pads. These I cannot read. I think that says RX, but I'm not sure if it goes to the one on the corner, the one next to it. Very difficult to see. Maybe if I can zoom in with the camera. Ah, yes, there we go. We've got TX and RX, so we can use that for camera controls. And I do believe Betaflight supports camera controls for the RunCam. I think it also in Betaflight 4 supports camera controls, so you can turn the camera on and off with a switch and possibly other control functions. Of course, it comes with a wiring harness, metal screws, nylon standoffs, and nuts for your mounting, that little SD card keeper I already spoke of, an adapter for your 19 by 19 mounting, the obligatory lens cap. Of course, the camera is 14 millimeters by 14 millimeters. It looks to be 20 millimeters long from front to back. It weighs 10 3/4 grams. The Caddx baby turtle weighs almost 12 grams. So the first thing I'm going to do is the light testing that I've been doing with cameras, and this is for the FPV view. You can see the little red dot up there, and I do like the little red dot. I prefer that over runtime and the record that the Caddx uses. It's less obtrusive in our OSD, but here I do a couple different things to kind of test the light handling of the FPV view. This also gives you an idea of what it looks like when you're in the goggles as well. It's hard for me to say whether this is much better or not, because I've recently discovered that with the new SkyZone goggles that I've been using as daily drivers, that this view appears better than it did with the HDOs. And when I mention the SkyZone goggles, those are the 030 SkyZone goggles. This is the same test, it's just looking at the HD side of things, doing a lens test where I cover it completely with my cloth, and then the other one where I just kind of block the sun away from the lens rather than putting the cloth directly on the lens. Two different sorts of tests, and then we bop it down into the garage to see what we can look at. And we, of course, just like with the last test, we step forward a little bit to try to get a little bit of that sun flare or lens, get some of that bright sunlight out of the lens, and step forward and then kind of move it down there into the garage so we get some true differences between how it appears in the sun and how quickly it adjusts. Of course, the HD view isn't quite as important for piloting purposes. So I've set it down and we're going to take off. We have a slight breeze, but it's relatively calm. I'm going to stay low so I don't introduce any oddities from the wind, and we're just going to cruise around. This is my normal rig that I use on all these HD cams sort of testing, although I'll be testing another one and I won't be using the same rig because it's a little bit of a special board, but that's coming down the line in another video. Also, if you notice any jitters or micro vibrations coming out in the HD version, it's probably because of my quad or the mounting of the camera. I'm using a TPU print, and I don't know if it's the print or if my tune is slightly off. I did put fresh props on to make sure it wasn't props introducing any of those micro vibrations. So if you see any of that, I know we see it when I pick up speed. So that's not the camera, that's the quad probably, or some component of the quad. Maybe the motors are just getting kind of grindy or something, and that's introducing some micro vibrations. Another thing that we're oftentimes worried about is latency. I don't have a good, simple way of showing the latency. I think that's something that as reviewers in general, we've struggled to kind of deal with. And we're showing this view of the house. You can get an idea of the fisheye in the HD view just to see how much fisheye there is. This was actually suggested by, was that License to Drive or somebody else, just talking about straight lines and maybe pulling up to the garage rather than going up high and looking at the horizon, that maybe looking at the garage with the straight lines that we have with the white borders was a better idea. So I appreciate that input. We're going to pick up speed, and this is where I'm going to kind of just get a feel for it. This is not my first flight with it. Don't let me fool you there. I've had this out for several different flights, mainly looking at, you know, my quad and any micro vibrations it might be introducing and trying to improve that. But this is where I've landed on that. But I pick up speed, and I don't know about the latency issue. I've heard people say with these cameras they feel it. I don't know if that's a placebo, if they just think they feel it, or if it's really there. I don't notice it, and you'll see in this video as sometimes I pick up speed and I'll actually, there's a bit here where I'm kind of circling at a fairly decent rate around the cul-de-sac, and I'm kind of wiggling the quad on the roll back and forth just to see if I can tell any difference between my input to the sticks and how the quad responds, and, you know, any latency or offset there that as a pilot could be of concern. I don't notice it. But of course, I'm not flying extraordinarily close proximity. I suppose if I were to put this on a whoop and fly in the house, maybe, because everything's just closer in the house. But as you see me flying around outside here, I just don't notice it. Maybe I'm just one of those individuals who isn't very prone to noticing the latency. I do a couple flips and I go into the trees and do a couple, I guess it's rolls, not flips. I do a couple rolls just because those are quicker, just to see if I get the timing off or if I notice anything. It didn't stop when I expected to stop. The short answer is I guess I'm going on much too long about the latency. I can't feel it. Some people might, some people won't. I don't know of any way to give you any guidance on whether or not it will impact you. I'm sure if we got a DRL racer, somebody who flies, you know, just flat out, maybe they notice it, but, you know, until we can get one of those guys to do a review, maybe we'll find out. Maybe there's a good way to test latency. Now, I haven't done a lot of camera reviews because of the latency issue. I've only recently started to do camera reviews again. And the only time I felt latency, I think it was on an all-in-one, like a Cyclops. I don't know if it's the V1, V2, or V3. And this was an all-in-one CMOS camera with a super wide field of view that had a DVR built into it. And that one, I definitely noticed the latency on it. Matter of fact, it affected my flying quite a bit. Now, I don't know if that's an extreme example or if that just got to a threshold where I started to notice the latency. If some of you are familiar with the Cyclops all-in-one cameras and DVRs, maybe there was a version out there that was substantially worse than the others. If there is, that's probably the one that I was reviewing, because I definitely noticed some latency on that. But with this, I would just fly it. I would put it on anything that I own and I would just fly it. I don't have any sort of basis to be able to tell you whether it's going to impact you or not, but it's something to keep in mind. Fly into the garage so we can see that red cooler. I always think that red cooler is pretty important, and usually we have two red vehicles in the neighborhood as well. Red seems to be a color that these HD cameras can really show their sensitivity to that particular color or the color palette. This is a pre-recorded video of me going through the settings of the camera, and I pre-recorded it for a couple of reasons. One, I have got a 400 milliwatt VTX on here, so I've got a fan running, and that would just blow out the audio. The two buttons on the side, I kind of like the two buttons for navigation. I thought it was pretty easy. I show you all the different video settings. You have a couple different video settings you can change out to, but one of the things that stuck out to me was that this camera, and maybe the Caddx ones do it too, but off the top of my head here, I don't think they did, but correct me if I'm wrong there down in the comments, and I'll pin that comment or I'll add it to the video description. But this one has the ability to flip the camera so you can mount it upside down if you need to. Maybe it helps keep the cables that are running from the camera to the board out of harm's way. I just thought that was a feature that I've had to use before with other cameras, and it might come in handy for us as well with this new Nano line of HD FPV micro cameras. I did update the firmware on this as well. RunCam had released a firmware since I received mine. The version that I'm running is 2.4.3, which you can find on the download section of the RunCam website. And updating is pretty straightforward. You put the file on your SD card, you put it in the SD card slot, you power up the machine, you watch it on a video monitor in your goggles, and then you wait for it to be done where the camera just goes off, and then you turn the quad off or pull the battery off the quad, take the SD card out. Now I have found when I do that on most of these cameras, the file that you put on the SD card is now gone. But it's always good to take the SD card out, check it, and then put it back in the machine before your next flight. So I was pretty pleased with my experience, and something else that might be pretty pleasing is that this is coming in at $69. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's cheaper than we've seen on the other products in the same sort of category. So these things are coming down in price, and maybe that's part of 4K coming out and that being at a higher price point to where we have these new versions of these cams that are nano sized that are now becoming more inexpensive, which is good for all of us. I'll put a link down below to the product where you can look this up and you can make a purchase of your own. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, or otherwise, please let me know in the section down below. I appreciate your time, and thanks for watching.